Welcome to Inside Politics. My name is Anastasiya Lavrina. In this edition, we are going to talk about new Trump's administration. On January 20, we watched the inauguration ceremony. Donald Trump is in power now, and what about his attitude to our region, to the South Caucasus? What about the expectations and possible consequences? More on this, we'll talk with our special guest. Joining me now is Damian Krunevich-Mishkovich, former senior special advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly, and now is a professor of practice, director of policy research, analysis and publications, Institute for Development and Diplomacy at other university. Warm welcome to Inside Politics.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much. So Donald Trump is in power now. How is Trump transforming the United States of America?
Well, let's start with his second inaugural. President Trump, now President Trump again, has spoke of a new golden age of America. He just at the beginning of his speech, he talked about the return of sovereignty, the primacy of sovereignty. He talked about providing safety for Americans, closing borders, emphasizing all of these relatively traditional ways of understanding, certainly of understanding America's role, not so much in the world, but the way that America projects its power. When I say traditional, I mean not so much in the way that it was understood recently, over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 presidencies. So in that sense, I think that we have this focus now on core diplomatic activities, right? Trump has spoken a lot and repeated this phrase in his second inaugural, putting America first. So what does that mean in terms of foreign policy? It means that if something is not understood as being integral to his understanding of what constitutes American national interests, he is going to try very hard not to involve the United States in those sorts of what could be considered, or what he considers to be, peripheral activities, right? So I'll give you one example of this. They've gotten rid of what they've called now sort of divisive political or cultural issues. And when the Trump administration now talks about divisive political or cultural issues, they mean divisive in 2 ways, or in 2 categories. On the one hand, divisive within the American domestic context, but also divisive in the context of abroad, right? So, for instance, since we're in Azerbaijan, right, there has always been this concern that priorities expressed by previous American administrations on specific issues are not well received by Azerbaijan, by the state. It seems possible that these sorts of priorities in past administrations will not be repeated or will not be emphasized, certainly not in the same way, in this second Trump administration.
Very interesting. We all watched his inauguration speech, and that was quite interesting to observe that he tried to concentrate on the domestic issues of the United States of America, and it's quite understandable. He's talking to the people who voted for him, but he also made some promises coming back to the situation about Russia and Ukraine, about Iran, about Middle East, and definitely about its attitude to the future development of the relations with the European Union. In all of this foreign policy agenda, where do you see Trump stand when it comes to the South Caucasus?
I think we need to put this again in a broader context, right? If we go back to his second inaugural, he didn't talk a lot about foreign policy. He wasn't very specific, except in a couple of very, very specific contexts that basically had to do with the New World, with the American hemisphere, right? He had this thing about Panama and so on.
America first.
America first, but America first, not just sort of America as in the United States, but America first, you could almost say in the context of sort of hemispheric focus. But he did say he made a general statement about how, I'm paraphrasing, but basically, he wants to be a peacemaker and a unifier, right? And the way that he set that up was to talk about how important it is to be measured, or for his success to be measured by the wars he ends and the wars that he doesn't start. That's a very different type of rhetoric from what we had in several previous administrations, particularly the Biden administration, at least in terms of emphasis, right? So that's something that will, I think, be reflected across the board. It will be reflected in the context of, presumably in the context of how he is going to try very hard to shift the burden of supporting Ukraine to the Europeans. I think that's probably going to be combined with an emphasis on the importance of entering into a process of negotiations. That certainly was not the way that it was understood in the Biden administration for a very long time, until very, very recently, but it went nowhere. It was almost anathema to sort of the Washington consensus that was built by the Biden administration to even talk about negotiating with Russia. I think that that's going to change. You saw in the very last days of the Biden administration, the incoming Trump administration essentially taking credit for having successfully negotiated a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the context of Gaza. The Biden administration pushed back against that and said, well, no, it was ours. Well, maybe, but also the text that was agreed was more or less the same text that was on the table for months, and it hadn't been agreed until the Trump administration, the incoming Trump guys, essentially made it clear that they wanted this to happen before they came into office. And lo and behold, that's what happened.
So it happened because Donald Trump won the elections?
I think that it happened because Trump won the elections and because all of the players understood that his level of credibility is much higher, in the sense that, you know, Trump has this reputation for being unpredictable, but also in a way, for keeping his word. He's not known for bluffing. And if you're a superpower and your friends and your opponents take you really seriously, then you have a greater likelihood of success, all other things being equal. And I think that the Biden administration, especially in the last half of it, it was unclear even who was really making decisions, and it was unclear as to whether or not this would actually be followed through, right? Red lines were crossed, nothing happened. With Trump, I think the operating assumption of most serious actors outside of the United States is we don't want to test Trump's resolve. And as a result of this, he's been able to achieve a general sort of shift in the global perception of America's credibility.
But your intervention that Trump wants to have visible policy, visible presence, especially in the negotiation process. And we do know that, coming back to our region, Azerbaijan and Armenia achieved more through the bilateral negotiations. It was also stated by the President Aliyev in his speech. So do you think that Donald Trump may decide to intervene in the process, at least as an observer or someone who want to participate in the last stage of negotiations between Yerevan and Baku?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that anybody really knows the answer to this. I'm not sure that even the Trump administration, the incoming people who are going to be staffing the National Security Council and the State Department at the senior level but below the level of the principal, I don't think that they really have a clear sense of whether or not actively engaging in anything that has to do with the peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan is in America's national interest, as the Trump people understand it. In the last, say, year of the Biden administration, Azerbaijan certainly thought that the Biden administration had sided too openly and too overtly in Armenia's favor.
Yes, they had a strategic partnership agreement signed
just a couple of days ago.
Yes, some days
before. I think
before
was the sort of icing on the cake, or the cherry on top of the cake, or whatever you want. But even before that, there was this famous trilateral between, Blinken and von der Leyen with their respective people, and Pashinyan and his foreign minister. Azerbaijan's reaction to that, and President Aliyev has talked about this, Azerbaijan's reaction was basically, okay, that means that both the European Union and the United States, when it comes to serving in any kind of mediating role, are out, because they've chosen to side very clearly with Armenia. Whether or not that's going to change, and whether or not that is something that, well, it's two questions, right? It's whether it's going to change, and then even if it does, which it probably will, the question then becomes whether or not the United States will see that it's in its own advantage.
So it's more about bilateral relations, let's say, rather than to have more, let's say, it's more about balanced approach of Donald Trump to the region, bilateral relations with Azerbaijan and with Armenia separately.
Well, you asked me a couple of questions ago, and I didn't address it. You asked something about Iran, and I think that the people who are presumably in charge of thinking strategically about America's foreign policy posture, in not just in the context of Russia and Ukraine, but in the context of Iran and Israel and all this, will just look at the map and realize that between Russia and Iran is Azerbaijan, and whatever the Trump administration wants or doesn't want to do will have to be conditioned, or one of the factors in that decision making will have to be just basic geography, right? Azerbaijan all of a sudden it just objectively should be understood as being of much greater geopolitical relevance than Armenia. Now, there are counterbalancing forces to this, the Armenian lobby, a traditional understanding that somehow Armenians are, good, holy Christians or whatever you want. But at the end of the day, if you're serious about engaging with Iran, either in a positive or a negative sense, it makes sense to make sure that you have your flank covered, so to speak. And that means that you need to have a much more rational relationship with Azerbaijan and with Turkey and perhaps with some other neighbors. Again, if we're talking about Iran. So all other things being equal, it seems to me that there's at least an opportunity, maybe even a strategic opportunity, for the United States and Azerbaijan to come to some sort of an understanding that is much more even-handed than it was certainly in the context of the Biden administration.
We shouldn't forget about Turkey at the same time, especially after the latest development in Syria. And some experts already predicted that probably Washington may decide to have closer ties with Ankara when it comes to the issues related to the Middle East. And we cannot ignore the very important strategic role of Turkey in the region of the South Caucasus.
Yeah, I think that this is again part of this sort of Trump recalibration of the administration's understanding of what really constitutes sort of American national interest, right? Core and somewhat secondary, but still important. Under the Biden administration, and I'm always comparing and contrasting because it makes sense to do so, under the Biden administration, Turkey was seen as an irritant, right? As sort of the NATO ally that is most prone to acting in an independent way, certainly in its neighborhoods. A lot of the Biden people were not very happy about that. I think the Trump administration is going to have a slightly more understanding view of this. Because if the United States understands that it has its own national interests that are core and that are actually important, then it stands to reason that they should have more sympathy for another country, an important country like Turkey, that is, after all, a NATO ally and so on, and that isn't in the European Union, which I think is important for the Trump people, that a country like Turkey will also have legitimate core national interests that need to be taken into account. So my suspicion is that there is going to be certainly a very serious look or a rethinking about the level of engagement with Turkey. Now, that's not necessarily a slam dunk. I'm not suggesting that the bilateral relationship between the United States and Turkey is going to be, entirely positive. I think that's unlikely, but my guess is that it will be easier for the top people, either at the presidential level or at the foreign ministerial level or at the level of national security advisors, to come to reasonable understandings and accommodations in a way that probably wasn't always the case in the previous, under the Biden administration.
We do know all about the statements made by Donald Trump in regards to the situation around Greenland and Panama Canal, and he also said about his dissatisfaction of the influence China has in that canal. Therefore, that's why he decided to say that probably he's willing to buy this land to be joined to the United States of America. So talking about the Caspian region, we cannot ignore the role of China and Russia. So probably Donald Trump may decide to increase the influence of the United States here and its presence just because he's so much dissatisfied with the growing influence of other superpowers.
Well, on the one hand, you could say that. On the other hand, it might not be so simple. So what do I mean by this? On the one hand, you have this emphasis now on, or this greater distinction that I think we're going to see in the Trump administration between, allies and friends on the one hand, and opponents and even enemies on the other, right? And you can look at at least rhetorically, what we know from Trump's statements before he became president was that he really did see China as belonging to the latter category, right? So you could, on the one hand, say, well, the United States is going to increase its pressure on countries sort of, let's say, in between the West and China, which would include all of the Caucasus countries, to sort of make a choice, and maybe even make a binary choice. On the other hand, I think that the only way that that would be credible is if the United States really offered something strategic in exchange, right? Which makes sense given sort of Trump's propensity to have a transactional understanding of how foreign policy works. It seems unlikely that that is going to happen in that sort of, let's say, extreme way in the South Caucasus, because I don't think that this is a region that's important enough from the American perspective, as understood by Trump and his people, that it will be the most important, or in the list of, say, top 5 or top 10 most important regions to really exert that kind of pressure. And let me explain let me illustrate this by saying something about the European Union and the member states of the European Union. Economically, if you look at value chains and supply chains and all that, they're much more integrated into sort of the Chinese world than they are into the American world. That's not true of all things, energy in particular, but it's true of a lot of other things, manufactured goods and some cars, whatever. So it would make sense for the Trump administration to focus more, or first, on the European Union and its member states, many of which are also NATO member states and therefore treaty allies of the United States, and start there as opposed to try to focus a greater amount of attention, or at least focus first on the South Caucasus states. And I really do emphasize all three of them, right? Not just Azerbaijan, but Georgia and Armenia, but also across the Caspian, right? The 5 or 6 Central Asian states, starting with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. I don't think that there is a mood in Washington to engage in that sort of conduct, at least not immediately. And that means that the relevant capitals and the relevant leaderships in these South Caucasus, Central Asian countries have the opportunity to engage in a relatively positive way. There's at least some space there to try to do something to instill nuance in all of these bilateral relationships.
Right. While talking with you, I'm starting to understand better the situation, and in my understanding, Trump will try to have more unique approach to every single country in our region, especially after latest developments in Georgia, political changes and some problems which appear to be in relations with the European Union and Washington, D.C. How do you think about the future perspectives of Trump's policy towards the European Union and our region? Where exactly we should expect Trump to work mostly? Whether it's economy, it's energy, especially after his statements when it comes to the energy policy of the United States, or defense presence?
Well, I think that one of the things that Trump has emphasized, again, in his second inaugural, but also in his acceptance speech and lots of other places, there's this phrase he uses, drill, baby, drill, right? Which is this, and then he signed some executive orders recently, since he was inaugurated, that emphasizes this even more, right? This re-emphasis on hydrocarbon-based sources of energy, as opposed to some of the other sort of renewables and so on. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Accords, for example, amongst other things. Now, the point here is that if Azerbaijan can position itself sufficiently to be understood as being a reliable partner in the provision of hydrocarbons, whether or not this is particularly acceptable in Brussels, it will probably be seen positively in Washington, right? Now, Azerbaijan has all these mega projects that have to do with renewables and the undersea cable and all that, but let's not get into that because the Trump guys don't really care one way or the other about this. But I think that they do care about making sure that there's as much oil and gas available as the market can bear. And if Azerbaijan can make it clear that it's an integral part of that kind of thinking, right, that the provision of hydrocarbons coming from this country contributes to that overall emphasis in the context of Trump's energy policy, then I think that will be seen very positively. And in that sense, Azerbaijan has a strategic advantage over Armenia and Georgia. Georgia, to some extent, because obviously the pipelines go through Georgia, but both oil and gas. But over Armenia, for sure, because Armenia is absolutely not even a small variable in that whole energy equation. So let's see, that may be actually one of these points of commonality where the leadership in Baku and the leadership in Washington can really come together and have a meeting of minds. But also the leadership in Astana, in Uzbekistan, and so on, right? Countries that tend to produce and are able to bring to the world market oil and gas can be seen as sort of part of that solution. On the other hand, obviously, the United States is interested in making sure that it sells more oil and gas than anybody else. Fine. So, but nonetheless, that's, you know, if you're in the oil and gas business, all other things being equal, that at least opens the door to having the ability to have a conversation about priorities in a way that if you're not an oil and gas producer, you wouldn't necessarily be able to have in the context of the Trump administration's priorities.
Do you see any challenges for Trump's intention to export more, to increase the level of export of LNG to Europe, for example, while Trump's administration is also talking about tariffs, tariff plan? That's something Trump is willing to work hard.
Yeah, the issue of tariffs and how this is going to be managed in the context of a series of bilateral relationships is going to be very interesting to watch. Clearly, that's of concern to all potential countries that could fall under some kind of a tariff regime. You know, I grew up in Canada. I'm Canadian, so I'm particularly sensitive to this possibility that a very serious number of tariffs could be unilaterally imposed by the Trump administration on Canada. On the other hand, as it happens, Canada's role in ensuring the free flow of both oil and gas into the United States is actually very important. One of the reasons that the United States is able to export so much oil and gas is because it imports a lot of oil and gas from Canada. And it actually does it at a discount. It's a long and complicated story that doesn't really matter now. But the point is that this whole issue of tariffs really is of great concern. And my guess is that those countries that are able to find a way to engage with the United States under Trump and reach agreements, accommodations, deals, will be able to do so in part on the basis of how useful they can be to the advancement of other American priorities. So in other words, just to be concrete about it, if Canada can make the case that it's in America's interest not to impose tariffs for, amongst other things, reasons that have to do with the supply of energy to the United States from Canada, then my guess is that this, the prospect of tariffs, at least in the context of Canada and the United States, lessens or decreases. However, there's another factor. In the Canadian case, the Trump considers to be the current Prime Minister of Canada, he considers him to be a fool. That obviously doesn't help. So there's that aspect of it too, right? It's sort of, in a way, the personal chemistry or the personal relationship at the leadership level or just below, they can also affect these sorts of questions. And I think there you will see that it will affect it more than it has in certain other administrations. That might be understood as being a weakness, right? Because on the one hand, you have sort of Trump's understanding, or the Trump administration's understanding of what constitutes real American national interests. but then you have this additional factor of the personal chemistry that, again, might be a little more acute than it has been in the past.
It's more or less clear in the situation with Canada, but when it comes to the European Union, probably you can negotiate with the US to increase LNG and arms purchase, for example, in exchange for Trump refraining from imposing tariffs.
Well, you mentioned two issues there. Both of those are important, and there are a whole bunch of others. But let's stick with those two. The increase in the import or export of LNG, particularly oil a little bit too, but LNG particularly from the United States to Europe or to the European Union, that is, I would suspect, much more in the American national interest as understood by the Trump administration than has been understood under the Biden guys. On the other hand, at least some leaders from member states of the European Union are now pushing for this idea of buying or of producing and manufacturing weapons in Europe for European NATO member states. And that's something that I think is going, if they're serious about this, it's going to be very difficult for that not to be linked by Trump in the context of his deliberations with regards to imposing some kind of tariffs. I don't want to get into whether or not this is prudent, but it's simply a reality. And the leverage that the Americans have over allies, in some cases, is even greater than it is over adversaries.
Do you think Europe can afford? Do they have enough money for that? We cannot ignore the economic and political crisis we observed in France and Germany, the largest economies of the European Union last year.
I think that, this is a much larger question because the European Union tends to emphasize all these priorities that cost a ridiculous amount of money, right? I'll give you one. The most obvious has to do with funding, what's called, not particularly accurately, the transition to green sources of energy, right, or renewable sources of energy. I say not particularly accurately because if you look at the numbers, the transition actually hasn't happened. Everybody's been talking about it. Billions and billions of euros have been used to subsidize this so-called transition. It just hasn't actually moved in that direction, certainly not in the way that its proponents would like. But that's something that certainly is not going to be particularly well received in Washington because, as I said, Trump has withdrawn the United States from the Paris Accords. But the point is that if the European Union wants to continue pushing for this transition policy, the amount of money that they're going to have to throw into this to actually make it work or to have it continue to work or accelerate or whatever you want is tremendous. And the EU has a number of other priorities that will cost maybe even more in terms of billions of euros. And so they have to figure out what's really, they have to make a hierarchy of priorities.
Right, and we shouldn't ignore the situation around Ukraine. Europe is still willing to support Ukraine, doesn't matter Donald Trump will do that or not. That means they have to purchase the weapons from the United States of America and then sell it to Ukraine, or they have to produce it.
Or they have to produce their own. And
yes.
If they start producing their own, then again, there might be a backlash. On the other hand, Trump has said, basically, it seems to me that he's...
Trump already started to speak about 5% of GDP for NATO.
Right, and but he's also, he tends to emphasize the idea of making Ukraine Europe's problem, if I can put it that way. So we'll have to see. There are a lot of, the thing that those of us who spend some time thinking about contemporary geopolitics tend to underplay is cost, right? The financial ramifications of all of this. I think that the European Union particularly is going to find that it can't afford to champion all of the priorities that it likes to say that it wants to champion. And I think Trump and his people are very aware of that. Not just in the context of the EU, but in the context of all foreign countries that they want to deal with in a serious way. And I expect that they will do everything they can to exploit that heightened ambition in the sense of trying to figure out what can these interlocutors actually afford as opposed to what they would like to be able to do. And if there's a significant enough discrepancy between that, I have no doubt that Trump will try to exploit that.
Coming back to the region of the Caspian Sea, Iran and Russia. Just recently they signed comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. And talking about the future policy of Donald Trump, the situation around the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, and it seems that he is willing to continue its presence in the future negotiations between two sides, Hamas, Palestine, and etc. How do you think here the Trump's policy coincides with what we see around Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Iran?
Well, look, again, to come back to the rhetoric of the second inaugural, right? Trump clearly wants to be understood as being a peacemaker and as being sort of a unifier. I'm quoting now. So what does that mean in the context of Russia and in the context of Iran? In the context of Russia, it means that all other things being equal, he's going to try to see if there's a possibility for a negotiated solution that is almost certainly not going to be in accord with the way that the Ukrainians understand the maximalist version of their interests or demands or goals. There's also the possibility that Trump will decide that he wants to, or that the Trump administration will decide that it wants to negotiate directly with the Russians, which, again, would fit the Russian narrative, and the Ukrainians would more or less have to take it, which is again one of these very important differences between the scenario that I'm painting and the way that the Biden administration understood that. And one of the potential casualties in this could be actually the European Union, but it could also be the prospect for Ukraine's membership in NATO, which was promised in 2008, but with no end date, and seems very unlikely to actually come to pass in the foreseeable future. In the context of Iran, I think the way that the Trump administration is going to approach this is to say, look, Iran has not been weaker in terms of its ability to project power and influence and cause trouble in a very long time. Most of that has to do with Israel and the way that Israel has conducted its policy towards what Israel considers to be Iranian proxies, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has to do with Turkey also, right, in the context of Syria. So, basically we're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and then a little bit the Houthis in Yemen. And certainly in the first three and a little bit in the fourth, the Iranians are not as strong as they were before Hamas attacked Israel with this terrorist attack a year and something ago. That is almost certainly going to inform the Trump administration's way of looking at what it can do politically and militarily to achieve whatever goals it thinks needs to be achieved in the context of Iran. But I think that Iran is also very cognizant of the fact that it's not as strong, or at least the perception is that it's not as strong as it was only a year and something ago. And, it's one of those very strange situations where that potential theater of conflict could get a lot worse quickly, or it can get relatively better. It genuinely depends on the direction in which President Trump and the Trump administration wants to go. And I think that they haven't articulated, but I think that they may not have even figured out what it is that they want to do yet. And so the Iranians are waiting, and they're being cautious in the sense of not doing anything that could provoke the incoming or the current administration in a way that would make their lives, the posture of the Iranian regime, even more complicated than it is already today.
Just to conclude, Trump already signed many orders. He canceled many orders which were adopted during the Biden's administration. He made a decision of the future policy of the United States. Can we conclude that economy, tariffs, that will be the key elements and key tools used by Donald Trump in his terms of presidency? And when it comes to defense, it will be more about the domestic policy, let's say, the border with Mexico and some other issues.
Well, it's interesting. I would, again, to do some comparing and contrasting, the Biden administration was famous for using sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy. Trump seems to be, at least rhetorically so far, seems to be looking at tariffs as a primary tool of the conduct of American foreign policy. I mean, if you look at the results of the Biden administration in the sense of how successful was the imposition of sanctions on Russia primarily, but on lots of other things, the answer is basically it wasn't successful, in the sense that it certainly didn't achieve the goals that it set out to achieve. There then is this very strong possibility that you'd be able to, a year from now, or 2 years from now, if a tariff policy is one of the primary tools, that we will be having a conversation that will essentially be about ascertaining whether or not that was successful. I suspect that the imposition of tariffs, if it's done in a way that's not very, very carefully calibrated, sort of on a case-by-case basis, will not be as successful as I think the Trump administration would like to think, or at least has been talking about publicly. But we shall see. It's the economics of imposing tariffs and the benefits or the potential benefits domestically in the United States are questionable.
Damian, thank you. Thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today. It was really interesting discussion about the future policy moments Donald Trump may have in regards to the Caspian Sea, South Caucasus, and at the same time European Union and many other parts of the regions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Just to remind, today in Inside Politics we had Damian Krunevich-Mishkovich, former senior special advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly, and now is a professor of practice, director for policy research, analysis and publications, Institute for Development and Diplomacy of Other University. My name is Anastasiya Lavrina. Do stay with A News and see you in the next edition.